In the next few moments, I want to talk about what has been called historically the Synoptic Problem. Now, it's not a problem. I don't think it's a problem at all. Not a problem for faith. It's just a question, the synoptic question. And the question that it's basically addressing is, why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar to each other? You can put Matthew, Mark, and Luke right next to each other in 3 columns, and you'll see that they are often very much word for word similar. Well, why? Why are they so similar to each other? They're called the Synoptic Gospels because you can put them right next to each other and look at them together. Optic has to do with seeing, and syn has to do with together. So you can see them together. You can put them in columns next to each other, and they match up, quite astoundingly in some respects, you might say. So why is that? Why are Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar to each other? That's what traditionally has been called the Synoptic Problem. Now, for example, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have the same basic content, not all, but they have the same basic content in the same basic order, especially Matthew and Mark. This might not seem that surprising to you because it's the same Jesus, it's the same basic time period, but consider this remark in John 21. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for them. That's the NIV. Now, of course, John is being hyperbolic. This is hyperbole. It's exaggeration. But the point is that Jesus did a lot of things. And when you think about how many things Jesus probably did, then it's even the more remarkable that we have the same basic things in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, as you may know, is completely different, or quite significantly different. Doesn't have a lot of the same stuff. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so John would be an example of some other stuff about Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke then are all the more striking in that they have the same basic content. And the order is interesting because the order is not exactly the same. There are some interruptions. And this is pushing us more and more toward the use of common sources is where this is headed. But let me show you the example of the order with interruptions. So, for example, take Matthew and Mark. Starts off with Jesus calling disciples. There's some other stuff, chapter 4 in Matthew and chapter 1 in Mark, so there's other stuff there. I've not included everything here. But we have Jesus calling disciples fairly early on. Then we have Jesus healing many. Now what's remarkable about this is the story about Jesus healing many is not a story, but a summary. And so it's quite striking that in the telling, in the order of Matthew and Mark, you have let's stop and summarize the kinds of things Jesus did part at the same point in the narrative. That you have a summary of Jesus' activities at the same point. We might expect the same events to be there in the same order, but it's quite remarkable that both the text of Mark and the text of Matthew stop at the same point in telling the story and give a similar summary. That's quite striking. Then there's the Sermon on the Mount, but then Matthew resumes the order of Mark. Jesus then heals a leprosy. So it's as if Mark either took out the Sermon on the Mount or Matthew put in the Sermon on the Mount. That's where, again, we're headed with this. So Matthew, basically what we're going to see, let me just throw another here, heals a paralytic, calls a tax collector. In Mark, he calls a tax collector called Levi. In Matthew, he calls a tax collector called Matthew. Basically, and there's some other events I've omitted that are in different places in Mark and Matthew. So it's not exactly the same order. Sometimes the order is a little bit different, and then Luke, the order is even more different. Here's the deal. If you were to take the Gospel of Mark, add the virgin birth story on the front, add the resurrection on the end, and then if you were to take Mark and put in 5 major sermons, including the Sermon on the Mount, you would have basically turned Mark into Matthew. So Matthew is basically Mark with a beginning, an ending, and 5 sermons added, or, if you would, Mark is Matthew with the 5 sermons taken out and the beginning and ending taken off. So you have this very similar content, in a very similar order between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, let's take it to the next level. It's not just the content and the order that is quite similar, but in many places the wording is astoundingly similar, but not exactly the same. So it's not like we have an exact dictation here. There are often insignificant differences in the wording. Word, same word, same word, same word, insignificant difference, same word, that sort of thing. Let me give you an example from the Transfiguration story. And after 6 days, and after 6 days, Jesus took Peter and James and John his brother. So it's like either Matthew added his brother or Mark took out his brother, and led them up into a very high mountain, privately alone, privately. So it's as if Matthew took out the word alone, or alternatively you might say that Mark added it. The wording is so strikingly similar that if you were to turn in Matthew and Mark as a paper to a professor, you could be taken to court for plagiarism. Now, I'm not accusing Matthew and Mark of plagiarism. For one thing, plagiarism didn't exist as a category until modern times. I'm not accusing anybody of doing any wrong here. What I'm saying is that the wording between Matthew, Mark, and Luke is so similar that if we were going purely in the human, just from a purely human standpoint, we would conclude without any reasonable doubt that there is a literary relationship of some sort between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A literary relationship. What that means is that these three are either using common sources or they're copying from each other. Again, nothing wrong with copying from each other. But there is, at least from a human perspective, almost certainly some sort of a written, somebody's copying somebody, or they're copying common things, a literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Let's think this through here. Now, maybe the first response someone might say is, well, of course it's going to be similar. It's the same Jesus. Jesus said similar things, and didn't Jesus promise them that the Holy Spirit would bring to mind the things that he said? So that might be the first response someone might have to the similar wording. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work, for one thing, because these aren't the words of Jesus. This is narrative. This is the storytelling. Jesus went up into a high mountain. That's not a quotation of Jesus. That's not the disciples remembering things Jesus said. That's the telling of the story. And of course, Mark and Luke, nobody thinks that Mark and Luke, nobody has ever thought or argued that Mark and Luke were eyewitnesses. Mark and Luke weren't disciples. And so we don't have the words of eyewitnesses in Mark and Luke either. Although Mark is usually connected with Peter. You might say that Mark was writing down Peter's inspired remembrance. But it's not just the words of Jesus that are similar between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's the telling of the story. And in fact, even if it was the words of Jesus, Jesus didn't speak Greek. All of the Gospels are in Greek. And as you may know, you don't translate word for word from one language to another. There's always a change of structure to some degree when you go from one language to another. There's no one way to translate from one language to another. That's why we have so many English translations of the gospel. And so even if we were just talking about the words of Jesus, that argument wouldn't work because Jesus spoke Aramaic and the gospels are in Greek. So the similarity between the wording would still be astounding, even if we were just talking about the words of Jesus, because it's in translation. But it's not just the wording of Jesus, it's the telling of the story that's word for word. And it doesn't look like dictation. So let's talk about the supernatural possibility. Let's talk about the possibility that the reason why the wording is same word, same word, same word so often is because God was dictating. Well, the thing is, it's not same word, same word, same word all the time. There's variation. There's his brother. There's alone. And sometimes there's a lot more kind of variation than that. Sometimes you have the kind of variation that's typical of oral tradition, where the wording is quite different, even though it's the same story. And so, maybe God was just having fun. I'm going to really, I'm going to make some scholars really puzzle over this 2,000 years from now by dictating it in a funny way. Well, I mean, that's possible, but usually you want to go with the simplest explanation. And the simplest explanation is just that the Gospels are copying each other, or they're using some common source. That's the simplest explanation, and there's no reason not to accept it, since God can inspire the way you edit something, just like God can inspire you to write from scratch. And so there's no faith issue here in terms of inspiring the copying or the using of one another. So basically, the conclusion, the overwhelming likely conclusion is that somebody is copying someone, or that they're using similar sources. And of course, this is what basically all gospel experts believe. This is the conclusion that it is such a unanimous conclusion that we can pretty much say that you're not an expert on the Gospels if you don't accept that somebody is copying someone, or they're using common sources. That is established, the established understanding of all gospel experts. Now, Mark seems to be the common denominator between the three. Let's go to the next level. So we've established that it is overwhelmingly likely, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are either using each other or they're using common sources. Well, the next conclusion to recognize is that Mark seems to be the common denominator. Now, we're not talking about theology here, but in terms of the wording, Matthew and Luke rarely have the same wording in a way that's different from Mark. While on the other hand, Matthew and Luke may often agree with Mark against the other one. Let me say that again. It is far more likely that Matthew and Mark will have the same wording and Luke be different, or that Mark and Luke would have the same wording and Matthew would be different. That's way more likely than to find Matthew and Luke having the same wording over and against Mark. And so this seems to say that Mark was either at the beginning or the end. In other words, Mark is either the common source that Matthew and Luke used, or Mark used both Matthew and Luke and condensed them into a Reader's Digest at the end of the process. That's basically the most likely conclusion. In fact, 90% of Mark is also in Matthew, and all but about 31 verses of Mark are found in Matthew and Luke taken together. So Mark, if you were to draw, two overlapping circles, and the one circle was Matthew and the other circle was Luke, right there, dab in the middle, is Mark as what overlaps between Matthew and Luke. So it seems pretty likely that either Mark is the common source, a common source between Matthew and Luke, or that Mark is a combination and abridgment of Matthew and Luke. So which is it? Is Mark at the front end, or is Mark at the end? Well, Mark has an earlier feel to it, which has led the overwhelming majority of experts on this to conclude that Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a starting point in the creation of their Gospels. So, for example, Mark has Aramaic words that Matthew and Luke don't have. Ephatha, be opened. It's in Mark, not in Matthew and Luke. Talitha kumi, my daughter arise, something like that. It may not be daughter, but it's my girl arise. Abba, Father, is in Mark. Mark has Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Matthew also has that, but Luke doesn't. So you have this Aramaic element to Mark. Now, of course, Mark could have just gone retro and wanted to put in some Aramaic. I mean, it's possible. It's not a knockdown, drag-out argument, but it is one argument that Mark has an earlier feel to it. This one, I think, is definitive. This, to me, is the nail in the coffin. The Greek behind Mark is more Semitic than the Greek of Matthew and Luke. The Greek of Mark is rougher grammatically. Matthew's grammar is smoother than Mark's grammar is. It makes way more sense that Matthew would have combed Mark's hair than that Mark would have said, Matthew's hair is just a little too smooth, I'm going to mess it up a little bit. So from a stylistic perspective, it makes perfect sense that Matthew would have smoothed out the roughness of Mark's grammar, whereas it makes no sense at all to suggest that Mark might have roughed up Matthew's grammar. And so on this particular observation alone, the nail is in the coffin, and we're going to conclude what the overwhelming majority of experts on the Gospels have concluded, namely what's called Markan priority, that Mark was first, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a starting point. Another one, let's go on though, Mark also has less theological watchfulness. What often happens in a movement is that things that weren't sensitive at the beginning become sensitive later on. And so when stories are told later on, the later version of it tries to answer objections that weren't objections earlier on. For example, why is it that God strikes Uzzah, for touching the Ark of the Covenant? I believe Chronicles, which is later, clarifies that Uzzah wasn't a Levite. I can't. At least I've heard that before. I haven't looked it up lately. But you can see that the later version sometimes will try to clean up objections. Well, Mark doesn't seem to have that kind of a watchfulness. So in Mark, Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, and that's it. But Matthew tells us this interchange between John and Jesus, where John says to Jesus, "Me baptize you? I should be baptized by you." And Jesus says, in so many words, "Yeah, I know, but let's do this to fulfill all righteousness." That kind of theological watchfulness Matthew has to answer the objection, why is Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist? This is a baptism of repentance, and Jesus is without sin, and isn't Jesus the superior one, so why is he being baptized? But Mark doesn't care, or at least the narrative of Mark doesn't anticipate that. Similarly, later on, Mark simply tells us Jesus said, "No one knows the hour, when all this is going to happen, not even me." Luke doesn't have that line. So Mark has an earlier feel to it than Matthew and Luke do, which is why we come to the consensus position. A consensus here is more than a majority. A majority may have strong disagreement. A consensus, though, basically means that the overwhelming majority of those who are expert on this topic have come to a conclusion, and there isn't significant debate over it. Most experts on the synoptic problem, the synoptic question, have come to the conclusion that Mark was the first gospel written, and that Matthew and Luke then used Mark as their primary starting point. This is called Markan priority. There are some who would argue for Matthean priority. However, it would seem that they do so because it's important for their particular faith understanding. In other words, it's not the evidence that's drawing their conclusion, but they feel that it's important for their particular version of faith for Matthew to be the first one written. And so therefore they start with that conclusion and try to argue the evidence into that conclusion, rather than simply starting with the evidence and going with what seems to be most likely or most probable. So the consensus position is Markan priority. Well, this raises certain questions, and you can see the farther we go with these questions, the more you'll understand why some people have tried to argue it the other way. But for example, for many Christians, it is important to think that Matthew wrote Matthew. Now, the text of Matthew doesn't say who its author is. Matthew is technically anonymous. The title on the Gospel of Matthew was added later. And so there's no issue of inerrancy or faith here to believe that Matthew wrote Matthew. It's a tradition. Although, frankly, a lot of us get just as angry about traditions as we do about what the text actually says. But there is this question: why would an eyewitness, Matthew the disciple, use a non-eyewitness source, Mark? And so you could see that some have questioned whether or not the Gospel of Matthew would have been written by Matthew the disciple, given Markan priority. It's not a absolute, by the way. There's nothing to suggest that an eyewitness couldn't have used a source from a non-eyewitness, but that is a question that sometimes follows from the synoptic problem as you follow the train of thought. And then, of course, there's the question of where did the material come from, that Matthew and Luke have in common. Matthew and Luke sometimes have material that is pretty word for word. And this is, of course, why some have argued that Matthew might be the first of the Gospels to have been written. Well, let's continue to follow out the majority train of thought, however. Could there have been other sources, for example, to explain why Matthew and Luke would have similar wording at places that Mark is not a source? Well, the current majority position, now this is not a consensus position. This is one where there is some significant disagreement. But the majority position has been for well over 100 years, I don't know exactly, 130, 140 years. The majority position has been for well over a century now, that Matthew and Luke used another source, not an oral source. I'm sorry, I need to correct my PowerPoint. Another written source in common that is often called Q. The idea of Q came from the German word Quelle, which means source. So it just means some other source. So the current majority position is that in addition to using Mark, Matthew and Luke may have had another written source, a collection of especially Jesus' sayings. By the way, the earliest comment on the Gospel of Matthew, and it can be translated and interpreted more than one way, but one way to translate a statement by the church father Papias in the early 100s is that Papias said that Matthew collected the sayings of Jesus in Aramaic, and everyone translated them as they were able. So you could actually use this statement of Papias to argue that what Matthew actually, the Gospel of Matthew, the very first Gospel of Matthew, was a collection of Jesus' sayings in Aramaic. That's only one way to translate what Papias says, only one way to interpret it. But it might be, for example, that the reason why the Greek Gospel of Matthew is called Matthew is because this Aramaic collection of Jesus' sayings by Matthew was one of its major sources. And so that would explain why Matthew is called Matthew, even though Matthew in its current Greek form would not have been written by Matthew the disciple, and why it would use Mark and not be an eyewitness using a non-eyewitness source. Again, most scholars don't go with what I just said. Most scholars would reject, I think, that hypothesis that I just said. However, I've not found any definitive reason why it couldn't be true in some way. But anyway, it's all speculation. There are significant voices, however, who have argued for what might be called the Farrer position. And this is the idea that Luke not only used Mark, but that Luke also used Matthew as a source. The name most associated with this right now is Mark Goodacre of Duke University. So the idea here is that Mark was written first, Matthew used Mark and other sources, and then Luke used Matthew and Mark to create Luke's gospel. So the question here is, just to illustrate the issue here, did Jesus say, "Blessed are the poor," and then Matthew add, "Blessed are the poor in spirit"? This would be the Q hypothesis, the idea that Q had "Blessed are the poor" as in Luke, and then when Matthew edited Q, Matthew edited "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Or Mark Goodacre would say, maybe, that Matthew said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and when Luke copied it, Luke took off the "in spirit" to say simply "Blessed are the poor," in keeping with one of Luke's emphasis, namely Jesus' ministry to the poor and the downtrodden and so forth. Now that's very simplistic, because it's very, very, very likely that the Gospels all intermingle oral traditions with written traditions. So it's not going to be as simple as just using Mark and Q. No matter where you go, there is overwhelmingly likely that there were different versions of sayings of Jesus that circulated all over the place, to where the actual reconstruction of how sayings got to be the way they are is far more complex than any of us could possibly imagine. And so it's not as easy as this slide makes it seem as to whether it's Q or Luke or whatever, because we can't know at any one point whether or not we're just looking at two different oral traditions that have found their way into the text. In fact, Mark Goodacre, his strongest argument is, what are we going to do with these few places where Matthew and Luke agree in wording against Mark? And he would say, it's hard to explain that on the Q and Mark hypothesis, but you can explain it if Luke is also using Matthew. My explanation would simply be that there were oral traditions all over the place, and that it's very likely that in some points Matthew and Luke record oral versions in common that weren't in Mark. But again, the original version, the real version, probably was far more complicated than any of us could possibly imagine. Now, there are implications here. Probably the most significant is that we need to listen to each gospel as a self-contained story rather than as straight history. As I said, the order isn't exactly the same. If they're using common sources, then changes in order are deliberate. And this is a different way of thinking about it. The gospel writers must have felt free to paraphrase their sources, to move around events. This goes against the kind of the mentality of the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, both liberals and conservatives, the liberals said, this isn't historical. The liberal, I'm stereotyping here, but in the early 20th century, the liberals said, Luke changed things around, he's lying, and of course the fundamentalists responded, no, Luke didn't, he's not lying. Whereas the appropriate way to view it is that ancient storytelling, ancient history writing, ancient biography felt free to be creative and artistic in their presentation of things. And it's not an error, it's not a problem, it's just not exactly historical. And so the problem is with our expectations, not with what the gospel writers themselves did. For example, take Luke. In Mark, we have, of course, Jesus goes to the synagogue in Nazareth, and he's largely rejected in Nazareth. If Luke is using Mark as a source, which is overwhelmingly likely, then it appears that Luke took that story and made it the beginning of Jesus' ministry, put it at the front, and expanded it to include what we sometimes call Jesus' inaugural address. The Spirit of the Lord is on me to proclaim good news to the poor, and so forth. Expands that story in Luke. Now, of course, maybe Luke is following an oral tradition that isn't in Matthew and Mark. That's not my point. My point is simply that Luke felt free to move where that story appeared in Mark to the front in order to highlight one of the key themes of Jesus' ministry. The conclusion we must come to is that the gospel writers felt an artistic license and a creativity to move things around, to paraphrase, to expand them, so that they could bring out theological points, to where we need to read each gospel story on its own terms and not try to harmonize them or mix them together, because that completely messes up what Matthew and Luke were doing with Mark. It completely obliterates the integrity of each gospel by blurring the stories together. The gospels are not to be taken as videotapes or straightforward documentaries, but rather as truthful in the story that they tell, namely that they have presented the story in such a way as to bring out certain truths. So that's just a brief overview of the synoptic problem.